Hello, my name's Gavin, and this is Genre Books. And as we're just starting, got up August, I'm saying goodbye to July, and in particular, Rocket Summer. So here is my Rocket Summer retrospective reading roundup. Rocket Summer was a reading event created by Michael K. Vaughan and co-hosted by some great booktubers who I will list below the line here. And we were reading classic and vintage science fiction all through the month. The prompts moved at breakneck speed, so I will not be able to share my thoughts on The Four-Sided Triangle by William F. Temple, purely because I didn't get to finish that 1940s book before the 1950s trundled into view. But let's go through the stuff that I did manage to read or partially read. In terms of short stories, I read the first 100 pages or so of Isaac Asimov's Before the Golden Age, Volume 1, so his collection interspersed with small bits of memoir and autobiography, but stories by Neil R. Jones, Captain S.P. Meek, Edmund Hamilton, 1930s pulp stuff. Great fun. Also 1930s pulp, I read thrilling wonder stories and have a full video on the deep dive that I did into this June 1937 issue. But briefly, there are stories by Arthur Leo Zagat, Yando Binder, John Russell Fearn, Raymond Z. Galoon, Anthony Rudd, Richard Tooker, J. Harvey Haggard, Frank Belknap Long, and a couple of other stories and articles. And the obligatory Athlete's Foot advert on the back cover. So every week, for every one of the weekly prompts, I did a deep dive of either a pulp magazine or a science fiction digest magazine. So that was for the pre-1940s. For the 1940s, I retreated to my comfort zone of Planet Stories. For the 1950s, I looked at the first ever issue of Infinity Science Fiction, and for the 1960s, an issue of Galaxy Science Fiction. So I put all of those together because I did specific videos on those, and I'm not going to repeat my thoughts on stories within them because you can watch them elsewhere. In terms of longer fiction, I use that advisedly for this first one because it's a very short volume. I started with Edgar Wallace and Planetoid 127. The only Edgar Wallace I'd read previously had been a book which has his name attached to it, but is only partially written by him, and that is Quincunx. But in his time, Wallace wrote 180 books over a sort of 14-15 year period and sold millions. And this is one of the 180 works. It's you can tell it's been written in a hurry, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. It imparts that sort of breathless kineticism, moving from one situation to the next in rapid succession. Its science is seriously shonky, but it's done with great aplomb, and the hero is as willing to take on any task as you would expect a hero in an adventure story to do so. For a science fiction adventure, it doesn't leave the confines of Earth, it barely leaves the confines of a house, but it's got the lot. It's got a crazy theory, it's got an unscrupulous villain, it's got a series of young heroic characters, and a more seasoned mentor. It's also not got a big flying ship appearing anywhere within it. This is just, I believe, the generic cover for this entire series of the Green Hills science fiction and fantasy books, edited by Brian Stableford as a series. The next book was Voices from the Radium Age, which is a selection of short stories from the 1930s and before, edited by Joshua Glenn, and including a mix of classic and, to me, unknown works. Neil R. Jones is in here, who's also in the Isaac Asimov, with his story The Jameson Satellite, which is, I would say, probably the most stereotypically science fiction pulpy of the stories within. But there's also The Comet by W.E.B. Du Bois, which tells a story of apocalypse through a racial lens and gives a tantalising glimpse into how people may have to rely on each other regardless of the colour of their skin when there are so few people left. There's a story from Jack London called The Red One, which is almost more horror, but involves an alien artefact. It's another short story from 1913 by Arthur Conan Doyle called The Horror of the Heights, which, again, as the title implies, has horror tinges, but it is really a proto-science fiction story about alien encounters in a biplane. There's a very short piece called Sultana's Dream from 1905 by Rokia Sakawat Hossein, which is a short utopia piece written by a woman in Bangladesh at the turn of the 20th century, and sadly still relevant today. There's The Voice in the Night, which is the most horror story in the book, and that is a 1907 story from William Hope Hodgson, and that is proper sort of weird fiction. And finally there is The Machine Stops by E.M. Forster, which is a story I've read before. It's from 1909 and deals with humanity in the future having been loved and cosseted by this all-powerful machine that caters to their every whim. How humanity has atrophied under that regime, and, as the title implies, what happens when things go awry. All in all, that's a great collection, and I've got the second volume, More Voices from the Radium Age, which I'll be getting to in due course. Another utopia stroke dystopia story from the 1920s in the British Library's collection, and this is The Question Mark by Muriel Jaeger. Now this is a fantastic book. So this was first published in 1926, so some half dozen years before Huxley's Brave New World. It's published by the Hogarth Press, so had the blessing of Leonard and Virginia Woolf, who, from a letter that's reproduced in the front of this book, were taking a bit of a punt. They liked the book, they were going to print the book, but Muriel was only going to get paid if it sold a specific amount of copies, and that pay went up in percentage terms the more copies that were sold. Unfortunately, I don't actually know how many copies were sold. It would be nice to think that she did get some recompense from writing this book. I do have another one of her books, which I will be getting to, because I was very, very pleasantly surprised with how good this was, from a writer I'd not heard of before I'd seen it in this series. It deals with, I'm going to say a time traveller. It's never properly established how he travels into the future, but our hero, Guy, travels 200 years into the future from his unsatisfactory life as a bank clerk in early 20th century London, and comes to a place where it seems a very post-scarcity society, where people's whims again are catered to, but they do have the freedom to roam. But Guy does find himself questioning the utopia he finds himself in. What initially seems like the freedom to do whatever you want shows itself to be a bit of a double-edged sword, because there are only a few people who seemingly decide that they want to increase knowledge. There are only a few people who want to service the machines that keep society working, and there are too many people who are happy to passively accept anything that comes to them. What first comes across as a paradise of a society where people want for nothing and can do anything that they want is shown to be something that is a fractured society, when what you want is at the expense of other people, and that doesn't come to fruition. People react like children throwing tantrums, or worse, like adults throwing rages. And if convicted of a crime of passion, I've just happily frog marched towards a glorified suicide booth. There is unrest at the time. Someone tries to sort of start a bit of a religious revival to get some meaning back into life, and the society is pulled in many directions between those who want to impose their will on society, or to kickstart, try to get a response from people, and the largely sort of supine masses who are content to have stuff happen to them. If Huxley hadn't read this before writing Brave New World, I would be very surprised indeed. And in that first week of reading for Rocket Summer, the hits just kept coming, because the next book I read was The New Adam by Stanley G. Weinbaum. I did talk about this in the video I did on the superhero, so I won't repeat it here. Suffice to say, this is another fantastic book. There's the pretense of a philosophic inquiry into a question that we've not had to face, some interesting textual play of a man with two minds having a dialogue with himself, and an examination of a society in which a superman or super intellect arises. Very quickly editing myself in here, because I realised I forgot about the two books that I read on Kindle, and that was Skylark of Space by E. Doc Smith and Invaders from the Infinite by Joseph W. Campbell Jr. Roy, over at Roy Reads Anything, really went for the of-space angle for Rocket Summer and read Skylark of Space, Legion of Space, Colonists of Space, Borders of Space, and I think something else of space. But Skylark of Space is as far as I managed to dip my toes. And this is a very early space opera. It's a fun book. I think Smith's books are quick reads for me because I always read the dialogue as if it is that sort of breathless, pauseless repartee between Cary Grant and Katharine Hepburn in some sort of transatlantic 40s comedy. The story itself is enjoyable but thin. A flaw it has is one that it shares with Campbell's work, actually, in that without needing to do so in a novel, the passage of time travels very quickly. So they have an idea about how to do a spaceship and they'll get right on, design it in the afternoon and have the working prototype by the weekend. This becomes more exaggerated with Smith as his works go on, with the Lensman series, where they are able to construct vast armadas seemingly at will, and is taken to a crazy conclusion in Campbell's Invaders from the Infinite, where they are literally thinking about stuff and it is not magically, scientifically built for them. But Skylark of Space inhabits a strange no man's land between the oak panelled rocket ships of Jules Verne and the more militaristic, smooth lined naval efficiency of the science fiction works that come along in the 40s and the 50s. It's almost as if this is space travel as a hobby. And I think maybe at the point that Skylark of Space is being written, the Venn diagram of science fiction fan to electrical hobbyist is near a perfect circle. Hugo Gernsback himself moved into science fiction stories directly from a hobbyist magazine about how to sort of muck around with electronics. Campbell in the Invaders of the Infinite, which is the third part of his Wade, Arcott and Morley, I think, trilogy of books, which had Islands of Space and began with the Black Star Passes. Campbell takes a lot of inspiration, I think, from Smith's stories. I won't talk too much about the Campbell because I did cover that in a video that I've done in the past month. But I thought I'd just mention those two books as I was going through my pile of physical books, talking about what I'd read. Clear forgot, I did use the Kindle as well. Heinlein Next and Orphans of the Sky, which I don't know if it's the first, but it certainly must be among the first books to talk about the concept of a generation ship, where the journey to a distant star is known and planned for being a very long and arduous journey, and one which will take more than the span of a human life. And as most generational ships in science fiction, we see how that concept has utterly fallen over. I'm trying to think of a generational ship story where it does what it's supposed to. But something has gone wrong on this generation ship. There has, in the dim and distant past, been a mutiny. The crew who were killed have been canonized, certainly turned into sort of objects of near mystical religious reverence. The mutineers, whose descendants live at the top of the ship, are effectively seen as devils. They're certainly bogeymen for the younger members of the crew, and none of the inhabitants of the ship can conceive that there is life outside of the ship. The ship is all there is of existence. Records have been destroyed. They don't know the purpose of the ship that they're on, or can conceive basically that there are such things as planets, universes, stars, whatever, until they start to find out. The news hits all of them hard, but some are able to conceive of it, and some are determined to keep the blinkers on and make sure that the story can't get out. There is an overtly religious aspect to this, even going as far as one of the main characters to quote Galileo when he is effectively put in front of an inquisition to explain his behaviour, and says that the ship is moving through space, and is forced to recant, which he does. And I think it's almost certainly an attributed quote to Galileo, and says, and yet it moves. The factions on the ship begin warring. I think the factions on the ship have always been at war, but the events of the discoveries filtering down to the lower decks really brings things to a head. There's a certain set of characters who just want acceptance on the ship. There's a certain set of characters who want to have the ship fulfill its original purpose of getting to another planet. And there are those in control on the lower decks who just want things to stay the way they are, where they're in charge. And that's all very nice, thank you very much. Heinlein is one of what's known as the Big Three. That's Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, and Heinlein. Why Ray Bradbury is excluded, I don't know. I think the only reason I can think of is that Bradbury did not confine himself to writing science fiction. I can think of no other reason, other than perhaps he didn't get on with John Campbell, maybe, that he wouldn't be included in that list. Nevertheless, the next book I read was The Silver Locusts by Ray Bradbury, which is better known by its American title, The Martian Chronicles. This is a 1960 reprint from Corgi of the original 1950s book, which comprises some stories from the late 40s, I think, and the 1950s. There's a few different versions of The Silver Locusts, stroke Martian Chronicles, with some stories being added, some stories being taken away, the dates of the setting of some of the stories being changed. This happens because I think originally the dates were not far enough in the future to make them believable once we'd reached those dates. In here, the first story is from January 1999, and the first story is called Rocket Summer. But there are 24 stories or more here which are connected and deal with an alien invasion. However, the aliens are the humans, the planet they're invading is Mars, and in their multitudinous rocket ships that they arrive in, they are seen as, described as the Silver Locusts. They want to impose human culture on an alien planet. The time of the Martians seems to have come and gone, but there is still echoes of their civilization, a few remnants of their civilization, which express themselves in different ways. There is resistance to the humans turning up initially. It's not until the fourth expedition, which does sort of go in all guns blazing, that a proper foothold is taken by the humans on Mars. And this is all happening against the backdrop of deteriorating conditions on Earth itself as it slips into nuclear annihilation. Some of the pieces are, I'm not going to say poetic, I'm going to say elegiac. They're thoughtful, the connections between the stories are there but loose. There are a few returning characters, but the main character is Mars itself, and the book is at the same time a description of and an exercise in world building, which I think is absolutely top notch. Next up was a very quick read, James Blish's The Quincunx of Time. This is was originally a short story which got expanded into, I think we're on the cusp here of novella and novel. And for the most part, the stretching works. Some parts are a little bit over-egged, perhaps, but in general, it's chock full of ideas and details a time of future in Earth history where somehow there is precognition of the events in the universe which will help the human race to keep its place in the stars and stay on top. A agent of the security services begins to question the activities he's asked to undertake. The story explaining the reasons of why he has to do what he has to do are given to him and presented to us in the form of an extended flashback. There are some very sort of futuristic thoughts and some very antediluvian attitudes in display. But in general, it's it's a breezy, quick read and an enjoyable one. Before Rocket Summer, I did a series of videos talking about the piles of possibilities for each of the weekly prompts. As you can guess, I didn't get around to even half of the books that I mentioned. But one I was determined to read was this one, because I hadn't got round to it yet, and that is Arthur C. Clarke's Childhood's End. Oddly enough, I ended up reading two Arthur C. Clarke pieces back to back, because just before this is when I read Infinity Science Fiction, and the last story in that digest was an Arthur C. Clarke, The Star, which is an absolutely brilliant story. And Childhood's End, I think, is even better. If apart from anything else, it's longer. It's a full novel. It's written around the same time as The Star. Both of the works are a slightly different Arthur C. Clarke to that which I'm normally used to. The ending of 2001 notwithstanding, Arthur C. Clarke is usually very scientific about his science fiction. He is hard sci-fi. Aliens are there. You can see that in works like Rendezvous with Rama, but it is undertaken with a sense of what can actually be done. Everything has a technological basis. In Childhood's End, that is true until a point. It's difficult to talk about without giving stuff away, so I'll keep it brief. It's not the first story in the world to tell of an alien invasion of Earth and people who are more powerful and more intellectually capable ruling over us, but not with the kind of religious bent that Clarke gives it. And it's this combined with the short story, The Star, showed a religious side to Clarke, which I don't think is visible in many of his other works. I've not read all of Clarke, but I've read a whack of it, and certainly for early Clarke, there is no mysticism. There is nothing that can't be solved, that you can't solve with a pipe full of tobacco and a slide rule. When we get to 2001, there is an alien culture, but it is definitely alien. There's no mysticism there as such. Childhood's End, we have a mix of alien and mysticism, and Clarke does handle that really well. It's just a surprise to read it from him. But I'm so glad I got to this book finally. I've been wanting to read it for ages. By that point, I come to the end of my 1950s and was straight into the 1960s. Now, the reasons that Rocket Summer cuts off at 1969 is that when we're talking about vintage science fiction, the works are of a certain vintage, but also because in the 1970s the new wave takes over. But I should have known when I picked up Samuel R. Delany that I was getting a sneak preview into the world of the new wave, and the Einstein intersection didn't disappoint. It's an odd book. You are right in the middle of things. Nothing is explained to you. This is post-apocalyptic, certainly grim world in many respects. A large amount of mutations, most of which obviously are harmful, a few of which give people almost sort of powers in a way, but those powers, or those people with powers, are being found, hunted down and snuffed out by Kid Death, and our hero needs to confront him whilst at the same time realising that he may have some of the powers that are being hunted down. There's a huge mix in here. There's a little bit of Orpheus in the underworld. There is religious aspects to it. You almost want to say that the book's all over the place, but it is far more controlled than that. Delany knows what he is doing. He even comments on the work himself whenever there are interstitial pages here of the author's own journal as he is travelling around the Mediterranean, thinking and writing the book. And as he visits Italy, then Greece, ideas from the cultures that he is visiting, he is consciously inserting into the narrative. But how much of these authors' journal pieces are fiction themselves, I don't know. So there's quite a lot of things going on in the actual text of the book, which for I suppose I say a short book, but it's some tiny writing. It's dense stuff, very rich and packed full of ideas. Very new. I said new wave before the new wave, but certainly an absolute world away from where we started with Rocket Summer, which is, I think this book is the one that brought home to me quite the sweep that happened within the space of 30-40 years to the genre. Until now, when reading science fiction, I will read from whichever period of science fiction I wanted to. So if it would be 1940s pulps, then there might be something much more modern, and then something from the 60s or the 70s. Not really thinking about the grand narrative. I think this reading event has really sort of put that stamp on it. So brings that development into sort of sharp focus. When I was talking about the Galaxy Science Fiction Digest, which was the 1960s digest, I did the deep dive on. The last writer in that was Murray Leinster, and I spoke about how it was apposite to end that pulp journey with Leinster, someone who was still writing in the 60s when he had been writing in the 19 teens, someone who had followed that grand sweep of the entire sort of lifespan of what we're looking at in Rocket Summer. Someone with almost as much longevity, and someone who was writing after Leinster passed, so probably is comparable in the length of time he's producing science fiction, is Clifford D Simak. And Why Call Them Back from Heaven is 1960s Simak. This is pure dystopia masquerading as utopia. Again, a novel chock full of ideas, possible immortality, a populace who is parsimonious to such an extent that they will deny themselves everything in this world for the possibility of a more comfortable life to come. I would say that the most perspicacious aspect that Simak displays in this novel is in his description of the Forever Centre, which is a multinational company which has more power than many governments, which is a virtual monopoly on everything that still remains to society, and which there is a little bit of intrigue in how they are operating. And I think for the Forever Centre you could quite easily substitute an Amazon or an Apple. So we were obviously not taking Simak's warnings seriously enough. Nevertheless, I think we still have to be on the lookout and be very wary when Amazon starts to try to sell us cryogenic freezing as part of its Prime offering. But after 3 novels chock full of ideas, it was nice to have a bit of a palate cleanser with The Furies by Keith Roberts, which, I'm not one to denigrate it. It has ideas of its own, but it really is more of an action book. When your idea is aliens that take the form of killer wasps, then I don't think you can look for anything else other than action. But this was pretty compulsive, absolute page turner, and thoroughly recommended. And finally, a book that I've been meaning to read for some time, and took Rocket Summer as the perfect opportunity to do so. So for 1960 science fiction, Daniel Keyes' Flowers for Algernon. This is a book I wish I had read before I did the book about the superhero, the super intellect, because very, very germane to that discussion and a very different perspective on the story. Presented as a series of self-penned progress reports from Charlie, who is described as a moron, but he undergoes an operation which begins to make him smarter. The idea was to bring him up to the level that he could function more readily with the society around him. But I think it's fair to say that the results go sort of beyond anything the experimenters were planning. And our protagonist, Charlie, before long starts to outstrip those around him, including those who put him under the knife in the first place. Algernon is the laboratory mouse we can see on the front cover here, who is the first subject, the first successful subject of their experimentation. And when Algernon starts to suffer and decline, we know where the book is heading. I didn't think I would end Rocket Summer almost on the verge of tears, and it's not because I missed the event as good as it was, but it's because the last 20 pages of this book are devastating. The inevitability of what's going to happen, the rage against it, and finally the acceptance is powerful and heady stuff. I wish Rocket Summer could have gone on longer, but I don't actually know what book I would have followed that up with immediately. I didn't read anything further that evening once I'd finished it, but the next morning we'd started on Garb August, and I got stuck into some sword and sorcery with a side order of lesbianism. So life goes on. And that was Rocket Summer. Thank you to Michael K. Vaughan for creating the event. Thank you to all the co-hosts for the content they've provided throughout the month. And thanks to everybody who participated. It was a blast. I think this science fiction stuff might catch up. But until next time,